Imagine historians, linguists, culture writers, lawyers, sociologists, and ethnographers using cutting-edge digital modeling, statistical analysis, and complexity science to find pattern and meaning in the explosion of digital material we have created, using computation to bring new insights to an examination of the human experience. The Santa Fe Institute, known for complexity studies, is doing just that through an NEH-funded program called Foundations and Applications of Humanities Analytics.
Welcome to Augmented Humanity. Our guests are modern explorers working at the intersection of technology and the humanities. They help us to understand ourselves and the worlds we create in this digital age. They are thinkers, creators, makers, and academics working in diverse fields like linguistics, technology, game and object design, and ethics. I'm your host, Craig Goldsmith.
I'm your host, Ellen Dornan.
On this program, we're joined by philosopher David Kinney, an Omidyar Postdoctoral Fellow at the Santa Fe Institute, SFI, who is leading this new effort called Foundations and Applications of Humanities Analytics, which seeks to help new humanities scholars study culture through computational tools and complexity science. We're also joined by SFI external professor Simon DeDeo, a cognitive scientist at Carnegie Mellon University who is co-leading this new NEH effort with David, and with Carrie Cowan, SFI's Director for Education. Well, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having us on.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Before we get into some of the details of your new institute that you've created, and you call it an institute even though it's Santa Fe Institute, this is also like a sub-institute, is that right?
So the Institute language kind of comes directly out of the funding project. This is a program within the National Endowment for the Humanities to fund institutes in humanities analytics, digital humanities. But it's perhaps more convenient or more evocative to just think of it as an online course, an in-person workshop. It's sort of educational programming that we're developing.
Okay, so before we get into some of the details of your new educational platform, we hear this term a lot now, complexity science. What's the elevator pitch of what complexity science is, since we're going to talk about this, I think, for the next hour?
We can both give it a shot. So complexity science came out of the Los Alamos National Laboratories, actually, at least one of the main sources of people who worked in that field. And this was a bunch of physicists originally, economists, and I would say cognitive scientists. They had built a set of mathematical tools to deal with atoms, right? The things that make up your table, your desk, your computer. The thing about atoms, though, is that every single atom is identical to every other atom, right? So the kinds of tools, the kinds of phenomena you see have a very distinctive set of properties. So we got really good at that. We got really good at material science and, I guess, blowing things up. But complex systems was a plan or a goal of doing the same thing that we did for atoms for the richness of biological life and human experience. And the big difference, right, is that every human is different. We're all special eggs. And so that leads to very different kinds of phenomena. It leads to very different mathematical tools. We do a lot of simulation. And the kind of work we're doing here is, in some sense, the ultimate challenge, which is bringing these tools to bear on the historical record, on the arts and literatures of the cultures here in the US and beyond.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, I'm a philosopher by training, and Ludwig Wittgenstein is sort of one of the foundational figures in analytic philosophy. He talks a lot about, despite philosophers' best efforts, it's often not possible to give necessary and sufficient conditions for a lot of different sorts of concepts. Rather, different instances of that concept have what's called a family resemblance to one another. And I definitely think that's the case with complexity science. I'm often asked by people, how do I learn complexity science? You can't really give someone a complexity science textbook or a complex system studies textbook. What the SFI does is bring together a group of people whose research sort of bears that family resemblance to one another. And that usually means a focus on networks, a focus on scale and the way in which different levels of granularity of describing the world affect the observed behavior of a system or affect the system itself, and also a focus on non-linear and slightly more, complex relationships between different things in those networks. And so what that does is bring together people from physics, people from sociology, cognitive science, biology, ecology, and then also, as we're going to discuss today, work on cultural artifacts, including some artifacts that have traditionally been considered the domain of the humanities.
This is really talking about complex systems is maybe even a better way to talk about it than saying complexity science. It's almost more meaningful in a way. I get a complex system. If I go to a rock concert, I've got a complex system of all the people interacting and all of these different kind of biases and motions and all of these things. But I can also take a step back and take a big picture view and try to see what patterns are happening in there. So with that in mind, what you're trying to do with your new educational program at SFI is look at the humanities as a complex system. Am I expressing that accurately?
Or is it looking at specific texts or historical events as complex interactions?
Ellen, I would say it's definitely the second one. Not to say that you couldn't look at the humanities as a complex system, and that might be very interesting. But in practice, I think a nice way to think about what's unique about housing a program in digital humanities or humanities analytics within the SFI is exactly that perspective of looking at a corpus, a novel, a series of novels, maybe all of Shakespeare's plays, or historical records from a particular time period. Thinking of Simon's work on the Old Bailey records, right? Looking at that archive as a complex system or something like that would be one way of thinking about the kinds of research we're trying to encourage through our institute.
Simon, you're the computational person. What are your roles here in this project is what I'm asking.
There's two kinds of challenges when you want to study something like literature, history. One is obviously we want to work at a scale that historians traditionally haven't been able to work at. And that means drawing on tools from the computer sciences, tools that help us process language at a speed and a scale that an individual human can't. So I remember one of the smallest archives we worked with was 10 times longer than the entire Game of Thrones. So you can read Game of Thrones and maybe you remember all the characters. Right now you have 10 times that, right? So there's a real computer science challenge sitting in there. But also, and this is where David and I sort of team up, it's also a conceptual challenge. What does it mean to look at an artwork, let's say, where that artwork is giving you a experience, in some ways, an irreducible experience? How do we talk about that? What does it mean to talk about that mathematically? What does it mean to talk about that as a subject of scientific study? So both of us, I think, have our roles to play, but in one sense, it's very hard to tease these apart. The mathematical questions, philosophical questions are overlapping.
For the sake of the listeners, then, you just sort of mentioned a project with records from the Old Bailey.
Yeah, this is one of the first pieces of work we did at the Santa Fe Institute, now a few years ago. The Old Bailey is the sort of central criminal court in London, United Kingdom. So, if you do something especially heinous, that's where they take you, and that's where they still take you now. If you ever watch some horrible thing that happened in London, right, there's some guy being dragged out of a great building, that's the building. We had records digitized by the British government and some folks at the University of Sussex, Tim Hitchcock led that. And this archive ran from the 1650s through 1913, more than 200 years. We have witchcraft trials at the beginning. We have trials for women's suffrage activists blowing up buildings, right? So it's a huge range of British history. It goes pre-industrial revolution all the way up to almost World War I. And we were interested in how people talked about evidence, right? How witnesses talked. We were interested in the ways in which people described the same crime over and over again, right? The kind of library of awful things people do is pretty consistent. But the culture surrounding it, the way we talk about, for example, violence, changed radically. And so our goal was to look at these sort of subtle shifts. They're invisible day to day, even year to year, but over a century, they become more and more apparent.
Did you actually apply some computational tools to this archive? How did you extract the information? How does this work?
What I'll do is I'll describe the computer science, then I'll punt to David, and he could justify this philosophically, right? So honestly, it's just dumb, right? We just count words. We look at the types of words people use. We look at the vocabulary. We try and link words together, right? So if I say punch and you say, strike a blow, okay, we could have merged those. Yeah, that's a bit of computer magic. How are people using different groups of words? One thing we found, for example, is people started using medical terminology when they were getting punched in the face, right? 1750, someone punches you in the face, you punch them back, and if it's a fair fight, it's all right. 1890, from the point of view of 1750, everyone's a wimp, right? Everyone's like, I'm going to show you my cuts, and this cut is an inch long, and it had to be sewn up. So that's the kind of thing we do. And maybe I'll punt this to David, because there's this real question. What's the relationship between word and mind?
Something that both Ellen and Craig talked about was this idea of pattern recognition. And I think what Simon's just described is the technical aspect of pattern recognition. How do you recognize a pattern in some data? But of course, when you program a computer to recognize patterns in a data set, how you design that process is going to already reflect certain things about the hypothesis that you pose, and then how you interpret the results. One technique that gets used a lot, and I'm not saying this is exactly the technique that Simon used in his case, but one technique that gets used a lot in this kind of work is topic modeling, right? Where you try and extract certain topics from pieces of text. Or, you treat different portions of a text as what's called random variables and then measure the similarities or differences between them using certain techniques from information theory. All of that stuff requires a lot of interpretive work that's done by the scientist. And it's that process of sort of hypothesis posing, interpretation, some technical pattern recognition, and data analysis that sort of holistically comes together to sort of give you this relationship between model, which is going to be what you're going to use to sort of communicate and extract your results and your sort of headline findings. All of that is involving this really complex interaction of sort of interpretation, data, model building. As a philosopher of science, I'm very interested in this model-world relations, how it is that a model in science represents the world. For us, in designing this course with our target audience being scholars in the humanities, science has done a really good job of PR for itself. And one aspect of that has been a sort of sense that there's impersonal methodology that can be applied that will tell you what patterns are in your data. And I think anyone who does science will tell you that that's not quite the case, that exactly what I described of sort of this interplay of intuition, decision-making, and data analysis happens across the sciences, whether it's biology, physics, economics, etc. Really, in taking a scientific approach to the humanities, we're not doing anything that's sort of radically different.
I'm hearing that you're using really what I would think of as modern tools to do the same kinds of interpretive work that humanities scholars have been trying to do for a long time. Am I understanding that correctly?
I would say that's definitely part of it, but I would hasten to add that what we hope is that the availability of these tools, and moreover, bringing in people who are real subject matter experts in the subject matter itself, perhaps from a more traditional humanities background and standpoint, will actually lead to the development not just of better tools for answering the same research questions, but possibly by sort of expanding that space of what you can do, opening up genuinely new research questions. That's really a goal of the educational offering that we're putting together, and that's been funded by the NEH to do.
Because we were talking a little bit about pattern recognition, do you think that given these new tools, could it give rise to being able to see patterns that we never would have thought to look for that can be suggested by the outputs of this kind of analysis?
I think one of the most important things about a piece of artwork is that there's not one unique pattern sitting in there, right? Every scholar brings an interpretive frame to the work. We learn to read in different ways. What it means to be a good reader, I think, is to see the complexity of the ways in which different patterns interact. You look at it one way, this is a story about love. You read it another way, this is a story about class or race. So scientific approach to these texts needs to be, I think, augmented or made more subtle by that kind of task of looking for or drawing out one pattern over another. There is, of course, also this very exciting idea or possibility that we can not only look at patterns that other people have seen, but also try to find new patterns, things that might have been invisible to us that are sitting in there, things about the way in which literature works on the mind, the way in which history accumulates. It's possible to use these computational tools to see things we haven't seen before.
I'm going to have to go and roll. You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
This is so exciting for me and for New Mexico that you all are starting this institute. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what exactly students can do when they participate in your institute, and also talk about what kind of new skills and knowledge you're bringing into New Mexico. Because as far as I know, none of the universities have these sorts of programs. This is not a current offering that graduate students in the humanities can pursue in our public universities.
So we've been given a grant, awarded a grant, I should say, from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is the major federal funder of humanities research, to develop two educational offerings. The first is going to be an online course that aims to teach people the tools and the foundations of humanities analytics, which is sort of a broad category that includes using computational and quantitative approaches to study cultural artifacts that have been traditionally the domain of the humanities. Our intended audience for that online course are people getting their PhDs in a humanities subject. Having said that, that's just the core audience that we're always having in mind when we're designing the curriculum. That is not to say that that is the only person who could take and benefit from this course, whether it's, a really enthusiastic undergraduate or a librarian, or maybe someone who's even, an associate or full professor in the humanities or in the sciences, or maybe someone who works at a museum or an archive or anything like that. I think we could serve all those constituencies. That will then segue into our second main offering, which is going to be a week-long intensive in-person workshop, hopefully happening summers 2022, 2023. And then if we can make this more permanent rather than just the 3 years of grant funding that we have, on and on into the future, right? That'll happen at the Santa Fe Institute if such things are possible by then, which we all hope they will be. The online course serves as a prerequisite. If you complete the online course, you can apply to the workshop. If you're accepted, you can bring your own humanities analytics project to that workshop, and then we dive into it and sort of investigate it communally, and there'll be some great guest lectures that we'll bring in from both the humanities analytics space and just the humanities more broadly. There's a couple ways in which I think this particularly serves New Mexico. And the first of which is, if you're a PhD student at any of the universities in New Mexico, we'd love to have you getting involved. It's great to have local people coming up to SFI and sort of expanding that community. It's great to have sort of local allies and local people nearby that we can call on. By having the in-person workshops, we'll be bringing a bunch of really interesting people into the area and building up SFI, and the online course works to do this too, really, building up the Santa Fe Institute in particular and New Mexico more broadly as a hub for this kind of work, because it is still early days in the development of humanities analytics as a field. And so the traditional hubs of excellence that might be out there on the East and West coasts, there's still room to compete with those sorts of centers. And I think New Mexico can be well poised to do that.
So people who want to dip their toes in, get an overview, anybody who wants to can register with your online course. And it's going to be free. Am I right in understanding that?
Yes, and in fact, the in-person workshop is also free. We've been funded by a federal grant, and that's part of what they're funding. At no point are you taking on a financial obligation in any way by getting involved in this.
The course is a high-level course. We hope it's going to be a rigorous and pretty demanding thing. It's certainly the only course of its type in the country, if not the world. The other thing I'd say is I could think of 4 universities in the United States and Canada and the United Kingdom who are operating at this level, certainly none in the American Southwest. So this is, I think, one of the ways to put New Mexico on the map and a really nascent developing field. The other thing I'd say is there are spillover effects everywhere. The University of New Mexico State, New Mexico Tech, these are great institutions. They have strengths in the sciences, obviously in the humanities. But our hope here is that by bringing people in, nobody comes to Santa Fe or Albuquerque without spending at least a week. And so what we're expecting as well is giving people here a chance to interact with some of the best scholars around. The other thing I'd say is this online course is completely open. Anybody can sign up. As David mentioned, there's absolutely no financial obligation. While we were targeting academics, graduate students, one of the things that really surprised us is that we're going to have a lot of people who sign up for this course who I would say at the very least are underserved. People you would not expect were showing up to our classes, doing extraordinarily well.
And like you pointed out, that's really a regional issue. I mean, we don't have any sort of digital humanities consortium in this region in the Southwest. It's been very hard for scholars to gather in this way. Craig and I talked to a communications professor out at ENMU who was doing this sort of big data analysis of the president's tweets by hand.
He was doing a linguistic and phrase analysis of 7,000 tweets by Donald Trump and trying to tease out the kinds of language that he was using. I was just thinking if he had the sort of tools that you both are describing, Simon and David, I think he would have been able to tease out a lot of interesting patterns. This particular new effort for humanities scholars is at the Santa Fe Institute. For people that aren't familiar with the Santa Fe Institute itself, why is this such a good home for this program?
SFI is sort of the world leader for the study of complex systems. There's some other complex systems institutes out there, but Santa Fe definitely top of that list is a dedicated research center for complex systems. SFI was founded as this sort of spin-off from people from Los Alamos that wanted to do sort of more interdisciplinary work, again, in this sort of broad area of complex systems research that covers biology, ecology, also physics, economics, basically anything where sort of scale and networks are interacting, especially in sort of nonlinear ways, in ways that really need to be studied at those different levels of scales in order to really see what's so novel and so important about them. And I think just in virtue of the interdisciplinary nature of the questions, SFI has become a place where, unlike in a lot of universities, where because of the department structure, academics are kind of siloed into their disciplines, SFI just sort of in virtue of its mission, in virtue of the questions that it's asking, has to be sort of interdisciplinary from the start. It has to be the kind of place where a biologist, an economist, and a physicist can all work together and where that's facilitated and encouraged rather than discouraged, as it often is by the more traditional academic culture. And the reason I say all this is because I think the kinds of questions that are most interesting within the digital humanities space and humanities analytics space are also interdisciplinary by their very nature, right? They really can't be answered well unless you have someone from the computational background, someone from the humanities background, those people at least in the same room. Maybe they're not all authors on the paper. Maybe the two authors are both people whose PhDs are in English, but they're at least collaborating with someone who's more of an expert on the computational side. Or maybe it is two scientists, but they're writing this paper because they had a great conversation over coffee with a historian. That's the kind of thing that we can do at SFI that can be done in other places, but I don't know that it's being done quite as well, frankly, as it's being done in other places. That sounds very
Somehow they're not doing it. I don't know, David, right?
That's why I know the NEH was excited to work with us, in part because I think they see that potential. It's cool, I think, that New Mexico has something like that, where you've got people in Washington, D.C. coming to us and saying, we'd be really interested to work with you. So I think that's really great.
I think it's really exciting. I'm curious, SFI hasn't really had a focus on the humanities per se previously, right? It's been much more sort of rooted in inquiry in the sciences, right? What are these questions that you find so compelling in the digital humanities arena? And is that what inspired you to create an institute that focuses on applying these approaches to the humanities or to humanistic inquiry?
One thing I'd say is that at the Institute, we have had some tradition in the humanities, and that's in part because we have many amazing archaeologists and anthropologists who pass through. If you come to Santa Fe or to the American Southwest to study cultures that are indigenous to this region, either in the great past or in the contemporary world, you're listening to people, you're reading the transcripts of things that people said, you're listening to their stories. So I think there's always been this lurking in the background for the Institute, an attention to the lived experience of the world. That's always been there for us. This kind of collaboration, though, is certainly at a scale that we haven't seen before. And the kinds of questions that come up for us are psychological questions, at least for me, the ways in which we experience things, but experience these kind of irreducible objects. Out in Silicon Valley, people are modeling, studying the ways in which we read news feeds, the ways in which we tweet at each other. Studying literature, studying art, studying historical events, these things are really unique. They're real outliers. And so that's another thing I think that sits around for us in the Santa Fe Institute. David mentioned this word nonlinear. Nonlinearity is when you take an electric guitar and put it up against a speaker and everything goes out of control. And I think one of the things that the Institute has been really good at is drawing people's attention to the fact that extreme events, single things, single days in history can change everything. Finance people know this, right? 90% of the stock returns in the last 30 years came from like 10 days. So practitioners have known this. Scientists have tended to ignore it. I mean, again, not at the Institute. We've been drawing people's attention to this for years. But I think that's one of the reasons that this is a particularly good fit for us. Art and events, these things are singular. And the Institute has been trying to do science of the singular for many, many years.
Are there some real-world examples? I know we talked in the first segment about the Old Bailey, but I'm thinking now about singularities or these sort of nonlinear leverage events that can affect a complicated system so quickly and so drastically. I'm thinking, I don't know, maybe a respiratory virus.
I've heard there's a bug going around, Craig, yeah. Let me give you an example, Craig. I mean, this kind of singularity, another project we had going was on the French Revolution. So the French Revolution is explosive, right? This is 1789. It's on a completely different scale from the American Revolution. There were, 40 people involved in the American Revolution. There were at least 5,000, founding fathers for them. They go further. They have a meeting and it lasts like 72 hours. Nobody sleeps. And by the end, they've dismantled a 1,000-year-old feudal system and are basically implementing some crazy philosophical system they read in a book. So things happened really, really fast. Some of the really basic features of parliamentary democracy, constitutional law, were baked in by literally whoever happened to show up. The patterns of that event resonate for hundreds of years later, but are constructed like a virus. It comes out of nowhere and it spreads literally across the world, for good or for ill.
And Simon, from what I know of your work on the French Revolution, in that paper, you're studying the relationship between rhetoric and persuasion, right? And whose rhetoric was taken up. You want to talk about a singular moment. The dynamic of being persuaded to abandon the French monarchy, to change your world, is really cool. And it's the kind of insight that we'd hope a student taking this course could eventually get to the place where they could sort of find in their own area of sort of historical or literary significance.
And have modern tools to do that kind of work with.
Yeah, maybe being inspired to answer a question that I can't even think of right now that's in that ballpark. Understand the math, maybe that 50% more that makes them think, hey, here's a question I could ask in my research and answer in my research that would be on the same level of sort of really treating what I'm looking at as a complex system.
Let me just ask real quickly, when can students start registering for the online course?
So we do not have a firm registration date yet, but it will be coming soon. In the meantime, you can go to santafe.edu/FAHA, and you can just keep checking that. But we're hoping to go live. Simon can correct me if I'm wrong, but we are hoping to go live with the course July 1st, 2021.
Fantastic. So make your summer plans now, right?
Yeah.
And being in New Mexico, hey, free things are awesome. If it's free, everybody shows up. You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
Thank you so much for talking with us today and for slow walking us through some of these concepts, which are very new and exciting. I would like to talk about a couple of things that you've mentioned. One is coming up with new questions or coming up with new ways of looking at things. And you've mentioned a couple of times that one of the things that using this approach can help with is dealing with really big data sets. But you also talked about looking at singular events like the French Revolution. And I'm wondering whether you use the same sort of big data to apply on a singular event. And then I want to touch on what you said, David, about how you build your model or how you build your simulation is going to inform what your outcomes are going to be. If you're looking at the French Revolution, did you build a big corpus of everything everybody was saying? And how do you weight what input you're using? How do you build that model to look at a singular event?
Right, exactly. How do you study the unrepeatable? And I'm sure David, as a philosopher, has much deeper thoughts than I, but this is something we deal with all the time. Before I came to the Santa Fe Institute, I was a physicist. In fact, I actually worked in astrophysics. And we got pretty used to this, right? You study the beginning of the universe. There's only one that we know of, right? We have only one sun. We have only one planetary system. Well, now we know of many more, but we certainly built our theories off of these singularities, you might say. This is not unknown to science, but at the same time, you're absolutely right. There's a philosophical challenge here, a conceptual challenge. It doesn't quite mesh on to the kind of scientific method we all learned in grade school, right? You get 55 Ps and you microwave half of them, and lo and behold, they don't grow. We only have one P and probably been microwaved, right? So how do we learn anything about the biological world? So I think that's a big challenge for us. Then we talk about, okay, how much data do you have? A lot can happen in a revolution, right? People are talking. There's, a huge number of transcripts, 40,000 speeches in our database. Some of these go on for pages and pages and pages. So you don't need a lot of time to get a lot of data. Third kind of challenge here, which is really fun, is sometimes you actually don't have a lot of data. We worked on a project studying Oscar Wilde's play, The Importance of Being Earnest. This is over in 3 hours. There's not a lot there. And so what you're really asking is, how do you get a computer to pay attention? The big stuff is how to get a computer to remember all of this, to process all of it. But when you study this extraordinarily powerful but evanescent moment, that's a computational challenge. But I would say also it's a philosophical challenge because you have to bring a lot to the text at that point. Oscar Wilde doesn't teach you how to read Oscar Wilde. And so how do you prepare, how do you form a computer in a way that it can even begin to make sense of it? So lots of really, really wonderful philosophical questions sitting inside here.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's not just in physics. People think of physics as sort of the science dealing with unrepeatable events or probabilities assigned to single events, because you think in quantum mechanics, whether some atom decays from one state into another, it has a probability attached to it, but then it either happens or it doesn't. There's meant to be this sort of irreducible fact that there is that probability there. Those kinds of theories are all nevertheless tested by building larger ensembles, and you have to make assumptions when you build those ensembles. In evolutionary biology, people talk about the n=1 problem, which is that we know of one planet where life has developed, and so all of these rich theories we have of how it is that life develops, Darwinian theory, and then all the addendums onto that, that's all a sample size of one in a sense. So how do you study it? Well, it's more complicated than this, but there's a sense in which you sort of project things into a broader space and you treat things as part of an ensemble and make certain assumptions about, well, here's what would happen if you change this, and here's what would happen if you change that. And again, as Simon said, very different from the scientific method that we're all taught in school. And I think what is really important to understand about science is that really the best way to present scientific findings is by making those kinds of assumptions explicit. And good technical talks in the sciences do exactly this. You don't say, we proved X. You say, we looked at X and found that if you assume Y and Z and postulate A and B, then sure enough, it should be the case that we would observe X with a certain probability of the time. And indeed, the fact that we observe X is good evidence for the validity of our theory. And sort of there's a mutual relationship between evidence and theory confirming each other. That's sort of what science really is. And so when we talk about bringing these kinds of scientific methods into research that's traditionally been the domain of the humanities, it's going to have to look more like that. And in some sense, sort of inaugurating and bringing in humanities people into that world is really one of the ambitions of the course. We want to get to the point where a Shakespeare scholar isn't trying to, prove that some play belongs in Shakespeare's late period rather than their middle period. What they're going to say is, if we define middle period this way and late period this way and look at these textual indicators of similarity between plays, then in fact, this play should be in the late period rather than the middle period, or it should be in the early period. And that's really all we can say, because science is this scaffolded thing, and I see no reason why humanities analytics should be any different.
Thank you for that explanation. That's actually really helpful for me. When I think about what you said, Simon, about trying to teach a computer what to pay attention to, or trying to apply these computational tools to the importance of being earnest, it seems like the cultural context is your wild card. I work with history students who have to be able to articulate the context of why that thing in history happened when it happened. So how do you model that context? How do you try and be objective about what is important about that context? I think for Oscar Wilde, it would be a little bit easier because it's a certain class, a certain time, a certain country with really rigorous norms of behavior, right? But with something a little bit more nebulous, like the French Revolution, I mean, you have all sorts of different classes and all sorts of different people. So how do you model that? How does that translate into something like a controlled scientific experiment?
This is a great question, Ellen. It also hooks into something that Craig talked about a little bit earlier. One of the things that we do when we want to build a model of a text, right, when we want to talk about a text scientifically, is we read one text through another. So we don't just hand the machine Oscar Wilde in this case. We don't just hand it The Importance of Being Earnest. What we actually did there was hand it two plays. We handed it The Importance of Being Earnest and A Streetcar Named Desire, Tennessee Williams. And obviously, there's a lot of good reasons to pair these plays up. They're both more or less covert icons of a queer tradition in the United Kingdom, United States. But when you read one text through another, and that's something that people in the humanities talk about, you can bring into relief one pattern over another. And I just love this result. This is work with Kent Chang, who's now somewhere on the West Coast. Kent is a scholar of queer studies, but also an information theorist, somebody in the School of Information. So you take Oscar Wilde's play, right? You have Jack and Algernon, these two male leads, right? It's quite traditional to say that this is also a friendship that goes beyond the standard Victorian friendship. When you read Oscar Wilde through Tennessee Williams, when you read The Importance of Being Earnest through A Streetcar Named Desire, one of the things you realize is that the pattern that Algernon and Jack play out is parallel to the pattern that Stanley and Stella play out. Now, Stanley and Stella in A Streetcar Named Desire, in case you guys didn't do the reading, right? Stanley and Stella are a married couple. So what we're seeing is, in one sense, what is a marriage for Tennessee Williams? It's a friendship. What is a friendship for Oscar Wilde? It's a marriage, right? So what we're able to do is surface these kind of implicit patterns that are sitting there, but we do that by, in some sense, training the computer on Oscar Wilde and having it read Streetcar and vice versa, which is, of course, how we teach a class in English literature, right? We don't just give one text, right? Certainly we don't give an intro class where we only read Beowulf. What we do is we build people up in a canon. We teach them to read one text, and we kind of know they're not going to get it until they see it in this larger context. So I think that's one of the kind of model building tools kind of sitting there for us to make use of.
It's funny you talking about reading one text to get another text. Maybe 20 months ago, 24 months ago, Google, for their translation AI, started, instead of having humans translating words or phrases, instead they were just feeding in entire translations of complete texts. And they were including poetry, and they were including essays, and then, in a sense, training their AI to overlay these things to sort of pick out what turn of phrase or what word would be the right translation. And that's sort of what I'm hearing you describe in the way that you go about modeling this stuff. Because if you have that cross-contextualization, that's where things get useful and interesting.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to an example we had before, to strike a blow or to punch someone in the face, these are equivalent actions. But the context in which one arises versus another, the use of language, is everything. Shakespeare strikes a blow, Stanley Kowalski in Streetcar Named Desire punches someone in the face, right? So these are very different worlds. And in some sense, we think of a computer being formed, having some kind of formation through the culture. We teach it before we ask it questions.
Well, and I was thinking about your example earlier about the Old Bailey and the rise of more formal medical terminology. I didn't get cut, I had multiple lacerations or something like that. And I was thinking that this sort of analytics could be useful. And of course, I'm bringing my own bias or hypothesis in here. Was it also the rise of things like autopsies and dissecting cadavers and the science of internal anatomy? Did that happen sort of at the same time that then people were describing things in more medical terms? Is that sort of what could be a goal of this kind of analytics, is to say, here's how their language changed. Are there other inferences or correspondences that we can tease out in what was happening at the same time in the same place in the sciences or in literature?
Nothing is in a vacuum. The cell phone, in some sense, changed how we saw the world, and there's no way to go back. There is no way to write a novel today. Even if you write a historical novel, there's no way to do that without being influenced by the present day, by what you're seeing. And that's a technological world, that's a social world, cultural world. To go back to this example of Oscar Wilde, you couldn't talk about certain kinds of relationships. Everything was more or less encoded. It was a pattern that some could read and others couldn't. By the time you get to Angels in America, everything has changed. That is a text interacting with, in that case, a liberation moment. Nothing is hermetically sealed.
I'd just like to add on to this briefly. I think one reason why it's so important for us, especially for the in-person workshop, to connect with people doing PhDs in the humanities now is because people doing PhDs in the humanities now are going to be looking into very new areas of research within the humanities. And often that's going to be non-Western, potentially non-Anglophone materials. And I think that's really important because Simon brings up this great example of reading the importance of being earnest through Streetcar Named Desire. That's a really cool research project. And there are sort of new things in terms of bringing out the queer themes, and that's fairly new within the academy. But they are Anglophone dramatic works, right? If we have a scholar coming in who's really interested in Brazilian women's slave narratives, and the question is, okay, what should we read those through? I don't know the answer to that question. I'm posing it. You need the person who's studied those to say, well, actually, you want to look at these Caribbean sources or maybe these sources from the American South, or maybe not, maybe something else. They're going to be the expert there. And so that kind of domain expertise in the humanities, it's a great example, I think, of why we need humanitarians there when we're posing these questions.
David, what you're making me think about here is the old Canon Wars from the 1980s. When we read Williams through Wilde, we're setting up an implicit canon there. And that's a canon that a lot of people want to revise. And that's exciting. There's a lot of stuff that we don't read or we're just learning to read now. One of the sort of very exciting points here is that we can start reading texts in a new way and through new eyes. This is a real exciting moment in opening up, decolonizing the canon.
Just fantastic.
Such exciting work.
It's actually kind of blowing me away. You're listening to Augmented Humanity. We'll be back in just a minute. Welcome back to Augmented Humanity.
This is so exciting talking with you, and I'd like to know a little bit more about the upcoming programs at your institute. People who choose to go into advanced work in the humanities as opposed to advanced work in the computer sciences do that because they feel like there's not going to be any math. What kind of skills do you expect students to bring to your online course, and what kind of skills can they expect to acquire?
One thing about my research, I work now in a fairly mathematical area of philosophy, but I don't have an undergraduate degree in mathematics at all. Many people in my field of philosophy actually do bring in significant undergraduate backgrounds in mathematics. I don't, so I'm sort of a late in life math enthusiast in some ways, and so I can definitely empathize with someone coming to this without much of a math background and possibly even significant amount of math phobia. So I'll say that there are no math prerequisites for this course, none.
So, for example, I'm looking at complexityexplorer.org, which is online classes from SFI, Fractals and Scaling, Introduction to Complexity, Introduction to Dynamical Systems and Chaos, along with tutorials on differential equations, etc. So you were saying these are not prerequisites.
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. I don't know if I would pass all those courses necessarily. Our core audience here is a PhD student in the humanities. So what we expect you to bring to this course is your enthusiasm and your background, to whatever extent it is, in an area of the humanities. Now, if you're someone else and you have a slightly different background, that's fine too, and no one's going to be turned away at the door at all. But that's sort of who we're designing the course for, in a way, and with them in mind. You should be open to the idea that these tools can be generative, that they can be generative of new research questions. I think if you come in as a sort of unpersuadable skeptic about the use of computational or quantitative tools in the humanities, then I think it's almost an analytic truth that the course will not be for you. We've had a series of focus groups with PhD students in the humanities and deliberately cultivated, a mix of people from different institutions and people who work in more literary humanities versus more historical humanities. And so we are sort of building up a sense of what that audience wants. I think a really great part of developing this course has been just reaching out and getting to know people through these discussion sections.
So this was built with diversity in mind. I mean, you all are looking at ways to make it accessible, useful, and usable in as many ways possible, considering that it's all very rigorous.
Right.
Right. Is there going to be a lot of hard math? No. A lot of this stuff, it's like counting. At the same time, we're really aware that people come in with anxiety about reasoning with numbers. That's one of the things we've learned in these focus groups is take it down a notch and then take it down another notch. And we can do that without sacrificing rigor, which is really exciting. And I think that's been a really exciting challenge to figure out how you can do more with less. And the answer is basically everything. The one thing we can't teach, right, is how to read. Numbers are hard, but you know what? Like, words are hard. What we're really keeping in mind is that people who are coming to us know how to read, certainly better than me. And that's why, we talk about bringing people from the humanities in. That's the kind of stuff that we're hoping they bring to us as well.
These PhD students who complete the online course will be coming in with their own projects, right? Are they going to need to build the computer-based queries, or are they going to need to have programming skills, or will they be collaborating with people who have those skills?
I think it's definitely going to be more the latter. I think it's more going to be about collaboration. We will see in terms of how many applications we get for this online course. What we're really trying to do with that in-person program is connect people who are currently PhD students mostly, but maybe in other areas as well, within the humanities, who could then go on to be collaborators, right? That sort of next generation digital humanities scholars. When we select people, we're going to have those kinds of collaborations in mind. And maybe that means that, one person comes in and said, I've already coded this into Python and I really just want feedback on how to write it up into a paper. And someone else has a great idea for a research program, but from their application, it's clear that maybe they're not as built up on Python as some other people, or maybe they haven't looked at Python at all and it's really just in this more nascent stage. If the project's great, we're going to be interested in bringing in that person too, because we want to facilitate that collaboration.
With that kind of collaboration in mind, especially for humanities scholars who may not have the computational or programming or coding skill sets, are you also going to connect them with what I presume are some of the finest people doing this kind of work at SFI to actually build some of these tools?
One of the exciting things about the project is we're bringing people from many different universities here to New Mexico. We're bringing, hopefully, a scholar of Russian literature and history from Pittsburgh. We're hopefully bringing a historian of Britain in from Dallas. We're looking at people in the information sciences from Berkeley and Stanford. So these are people that we're bringing in both to teach the classes and to build up some of these skills, to hopefully provide their first mentorship and their first experience, perhaps, of collaborating across the humanities science boundary.
Has there been any discussion of a toolkit where you're not just custom building everything for a particular research project or a particular humanities question that could be deployed in a wider way?
So that's a really interesting question. I think in some sense, my first instinct is to kind of push back a little bit. What we're trying to do with this course is really start from the foundations. I think there's a reason it's called Foundations and Applications of Humanities Analytics, is we want to give people the foundations where they can design their own humanities analytics project from the starting point of a humanities-based question. And then they have enough familiarity with the broad set of tools that one might use in order to answer that question. And they can be flexible and agile in the way that they do that. That's really our core goal. Because frankly, there are other courses out there that do more of a, here's how you do topic modeling. And it's very much about how you load the data in and things like that. Having said that, in another lifetime, I very briefly worked at the finance side of the software industry. And it reminds me of turning a service into a product, which anyone is going to tell you to do because a service is expensive to provide and a product is cheap to provide. I mean, that's one reason why it's nice to have a federal partner here in federal funding, is that we have the funding to do the service and not just the product. But having said that, in the long run, this is 3 years of funding, but SFI is trying to grow. And one of the ways it's going to grow is by getting into the humanities. And so what does the permanent offering in the humanities from SFI look like? That's an interesting question. It's never going to be just sort of click and output, here to the humanities project, but something maybe a little more programmatic to help you along that line that sits in one place and you don't have to take a course chronologically and go to Santa Fe for an intensive workshop. I mean, something like that could be cool. I haven't thought about it before, so that's why I say it's a really good question.
You will also be teaching these people how to communicate their needs and ideas to the computer scientists that may be helping to build the project. Is that going to be part of the instruction?
One of the big themes that we really pushed to the NEH was this idea of empowering people in the humanities. A point-and-click interface is in some ways disempowering. What we want to do is two things. One is to give them a philosophical toolkit so they can think clearly about the kinds of things they want to do, how to put together, let's say, a model of their question. The other thing is all of these projects in the end are going to be collaborative. We often think of the humanities as a solo thing. People sit down and they read all of Wordsworth. But humanities scholars have been collaborating for years. You have to work with librarians and archivists. You have a question in literature. You have to talk to historians. So we see this as part of the formation of a graduate student. It'll become increasingly common, but really fundamentally part of the essence of what the humanities have always been, which is a collaborative exploration.
There's just two things to add. One is this emphasis on collaboration, I think, is not at odds with swimming against the current of what professionalization in the humanities has traditionally looked like, which is that sole authored manuscript as being the thing that a PhD student is going to produce that's going to get them a job. With the world changing, a lot of PhD students in the humanities have to look beyond that in some ways. And I think scientific academic output, which is often much more collaborative and much more based on paper level outputs, bringing people in that direction is great. As much as we're empowering humanities PhD students to speak the language of the computer scientists and information theorists who could be helping them craft a digital humanities project, we also want to demystify some of that language too, because something Simon said a few times over the course of these recordings is the extent to which some of these tools do amount to counting. While I would never sort of belittle the power of probability theory and information theory, I think it's amazing. Everything I do in some ways is about the power of probability theory to communicate philosophical concepts in my own research. I will say that sometimes probability theory dresses up in very elegant formalism that can be a little intimidating to the non-practitioner, what can amount to counting in a lot of cases. And so breaking down those barriers and doing that sort of demystification work is definitely part of what we're trying to do.
I know that you're still developing all of this to start deploying it in the summer of 2021 and then refine it over the next few years. But through our entire discussion today, I've been hearing a lot about texts. Is there discussion about what this might look like if people were trying to apply it to music or audio recordings? Like if I wanted to analyze all sorts of linguistic tendencies in folkways recordings.
Between the two of us, Simon is definitely much more the digital humanities practitioner. And as I understand it, Simon's work has been really sort of leading the way in applying these techniques to text. Having said that, we have people at SFI who have been doing stuff with auditory media, and I'm thinking in particular of Tyler Margettis. He is someone who has studied phase transitions in jazz improvisations in particular. So looking at when a jazz ensemble jumps from one phase of improvisation to another and predicting that and seeing what the music does in the lead up to the improvisation. So there you've got cultural angle, and that jazz is this extremely important cultural artifact. There's also a psychological angle, right? Because the act of improvisation is so psychological. And look, if someone came to us with that kind of project,
you'd find a way to do it.
Here's what I'll say for sure. The online course is for anyone to check out. Complete that online course, you really love it, and you want to come to SFI and do this more intensive workshop experience, then you've got to apply. Then there's a little more of a selection process. We would certainly, I think, not be looking at applications saying, it's not text in. Definitely not. If it's a good project and we think it's supportable and it's interesting to us, then we're not going to disqualify it just because it doesn't involve text.
It seems like for people who are just starting to get their teeth into it, text is easy because it's machine readable and you don't have to come up with a whole new vocabulary. I'm thinking about trying to interpret film or visual art where you would have to come up with a whole vocabulary because it's not just the colors and the forms.
I wouldn't want to say text is easy, certainly not, but this kind of work is being done in a lot of different media.
One of the things I'll say is you think of something in this domain and start doing it, you're probably the first person to do it. There's something extraordinarily exciting about that. I expect David and I are going to learn more from the students than we even expect. What is art, right? Art is chance and time, probability and unfolding. And so in one sense, if you can build something that can find a pattern in jazz, then in many ways, you've reduced that problem, or you've taken that problem into a world where text and sound are not particularly different. And artwork, a two-dimensional, three-dimensional artwork, it's always experienced unfolding over time. You can track someone's eyes as they move over a painting. These are distinctions that are so obvious to us on the surface. They start to fade away as you get deeper and deeper into what is a piece of art, what is a book, what is a free jazz session.
Boy, this is fantastic. Really, thank you both so much for being generous with your time and your ideas today. We really, really appreciate it.
I feel smarter just talking with you all. I feel almost smart enough to go sign up for your online course this summer.
You should definitely sign up.
If you would like more information about this work in the digital humanities and analytics, and to take what will be a free online course from SFI that will be debuting summer of 2021, you can visit santafe.edu/FAHA. You have been listening to Augmented Humanity, which is a program of the New Mexico Humanities Council, produced in partnership with KUNM-FM. You can visit us online and find out more about our programs at nmhumanities.org. Our theme music comes courtesy James Whiten, and we've had production assistance from Tristan Klum.